how do we know that 50% of women should be in engineering in the first place, sort of thing. And I think that's like I wish I had the answer to this, because it's such an interesting point, is like, should like 50% of men and women be in every single job in tech? Or is it okay for there to be more of a balance? And how do we know when that balance is? It was always very much like, get women into those roles, like get 50% of women into engineering, for example. And it's just like, it felt like it wasn't for women. The sort of why are we hiring for this role has become more and more important over time. And what we actually need for this role sort of goes along with that. And the kind of aim is, as long as we eliminate discrimination from the process, which I know is much easier said than done, then we will end up with diverse hires.
Well, absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, Sam. How are you?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And it's brilliant to have you here. I think, just for listeners who maybe don't know who you are and what you do, love to get an introduction, bit of background before we kind of set the scene for today's topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the talent associate at Zinc, which is a background checking company. So we're a HR tech startup. And yeah, I'm the only talent person, so I'm sort of doing a lot of different things, and it's great, and I'm loving it, and it's a cool company to work for.
Yeah, nice. And there's your little soundbite as well. There's your people proposition. This is some employee-generated content that we just got. Everything's good. I really like it, and I work for a tech startup, so I love that. And we had a chat before, and we kind of communicated on a few different bits, and I thought you had some really interesting perspectives on diversity, particularly coming from a kind of tech startup background. And I suppose just to kind of stimulate and start things off, like, what made you start thinking a bit deeper about diversity? What were, some of those trends that you were seeing? What was the kind of start of your journey looking at this?
So basically, I started thinking about diversity more deeply. It was a gradual process. It wasn't something I just suddenly was like, oh my gosh, I want to look more into diversity. So the first thing was definitely like going to talent events. So I went to a lot of events with other heads of talent or talent leaders within the tech space, and you basically couldn't get through an event without someone talking about diversity. And what that always meant was getting women into engineering, pretty much, or leadership positions. So, I mean, I found it was sort of something that clocked in my mind, but it wasn't something that really like set me off. I remember finding it a little bit like, I want to understand more deeply why this keeps coming up and why there is a push for women in these roles. Because no one ever explained that in the events. It would always just be like, we want to hit this level, a certain percentage of women in this role, for example. But anyway, so that was happening a lot. And then following on from that, it was basically just like sort of seeing it come up a lot of times in a lot of different places. And I was starting to get to me, because I was like, why is it always women being pushed into roles? Like, because it's never said, like, it's never kind of a diversity is like taking the discrimination out of things so that women can apply if they want to, or can go through the process, have like a great process if they want to be there in the first place. It was always very much like, get women into those roles, like get 50% of women into engineering, for example. And it's just like, it felt like it wasn't for women, I think that was the first bit. And then I started thinking, if it's about having 50% of each sex in every role, then why don't we have a push for men in HR or marketing roles? Like, it's really weird. Like, this does not feel like it's for women. In fact, it feels almost counter to what women want, because they're being like incentivized to go into jobs that they didn't necessarily like choose to go in that route of in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And then the sort of like final thing that made me really want to go down, like explore this more deeply and like maybe realize how much of a potential issue diversity is. I'll just say that for now. We can go into a bit more deeply in a minute. Was like when these kind of mentalities started like slipping into my own company. So as the talent person in my company, I'm solely responsible for recruitment. And when these kind of ideologies, I say, maybe came into my company, that's when it really impacted me a lot. So as a recruiter, like my training has always been like understand the business need and basically hire for that. When a sort of undefined and unjustified requirement comes into your, I don't know, job brief, whatever you call it, that's really, really hard. It makes your job really hard to do. So yeah, so basically then from then on, I was really wanting to understand, like, why are we, and in general as tech companies at the moment, why are we asking, why is it okay to say like, oh, we want a woman in this job, or like we want certain person in this job. Like if we haven't defined the need, then how can we justify like asking for a certain employee, like, I don't know, based on, for example. So then I was basically, that sent me down the route of like trying to understand what was going on a lot more deeply.
Yeah. And I think, it's almost like this echo chamber, right? That everybody else is saying that the focus has to be women in tech. And like my personal view on this is that tech is like the great leveler. Tech provides such a great opportunity for anybody, regardless of background, to get a really kind of well-paid, respected, empowering career, because so much of the information is available. It's free. It's out there. Like it's a sharing community. There isn't the kind of nepotism that's come from other industries. You don't need a degree education in order to pursue a career within tech. You can find out everything you need online and start to practice and do code and be judged by your code. So I do think it's a great opportunity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be evenly split in every region, geography, between every demographic group. So then do you need to evenly split and do that? And I think it's quite brave for you to kind of pop the bubble of the echo chamber of everybody saying we need women in tech, but why? And also, I think your kind of framing of, is that what this demographic group actually wants? Are they the types? Is this a kind of a field that is going to reach gender parity? And that's like a whole systemic issue, right? That's maybe not even an issue, but it's a systemic setup that leads to particular genders, particular groups, particular ages, particular backgrounds going into certain professions in differing rates. I don't think everything's going to be like an even keel for forever, but we should aspire to have, I still believe we should aspire to have more representation in tech across the board. But I think that point of when it's seeping into your organization, and then because of the echo chamber outside, you're then given maybe something that's one, unrealistic, or maybe unconnected to the actual role that you're trying to hire for itself. And you're a small company, right? It's not like you're 10,000, 20,000 people. So I think, and how did you manage that conversation? Like, how do you think about it? What's the kind of questions that you'd pose and ask?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like I actually ran a workshop for like all the hiring team in my company, all of the leadership team in my company. This was kind of inspired by Simon Fanshawe. He runs a Diversity by Design, which is massively like basically this whole subject. He recently actually published an article and like some of his data surrounding all of this stuff. So that's really interesting thing to check out as well. But yeah, so I basically ran a workshop, and the workshop was to understand like why would you like want to hire people and sort of what does that mean. So there will always be a reason. If someone has asked you, like as a recruiter, so I had this in an agency as well. If someone has asked you to hire for a woman, this has happened so many times, there will always be a reason why they're asking you that. One reason might be that they literally just have like from someone up above, like investors or whatever, they have just been asked to have a woman in their like leadership team, for example, or a certain number of women in their engineering team. Sometimes you can't really do anything like about that as a recruiter, but that would be one reason. It's always important to know why. Another reason that people often use is we want to represent for like the more junior people in the company, like for the more junior women in the company, for example, that they have like they can follow in the path of somebody else. I think this is an interesting point because in reality, if you have a company that is like has discriminatory pathways in terms of promotions and stuff, like whether you hire a woman in the senior leadership team or not, like it's not going to stop the discrimination that exists in your company already. So that would be a matter of like looking at your existing company, your existing progression, like the discrimination that might exist already in your company, and understand like why do those junior people want someone senior to look up to who's a woman, if that is the case. And another one would just be like sort of that kind of ethical side, like are you like, obviously some people are more advantaged, for example, in interviews, some people perform better in interviews. So it's trying to avoid that as well. But then again, that's very much like, I think leads back to the business need. If you are hiring for what you actually need, and I think skills-based hiring is really related to this as well, then unless you have discrimination within your process, like you should be not discriminating. You should be hiring diversely because you'll be hiring for different things and you're hiring for skills rather than like university degrees or whatever. So that was kind of what I did. I kind of,
No, please.
Well, I just, that was basically.
Yeah, and I think, no worries. And I think that skills-based piece is really interesting. I think you've got a lot of commentators for, a lot of commentators against, people that are doing it well, people that are kind of vehemently against, or not vehemently against, but certainly against that as a concept. I think where I kind of try and strike that balance is it that skills plus strengths? Because actually, does somebody have the capability to be successful in that role in the future? Do they have some of the related skills or auxiliary skills that could complement the organization? And actually, when you're thinking about, the skills that you're bringing in, it's also the values of that individual, the culture that it brings, the different dynamic. And I think some of those things are then lost of like, we want to bring more empathy into the organization, or we want to bring more creativity in, or, we want to kind of balance the setting of the team and bring that culture add in. So I think there's a lot of those like streams that need to be pulled out. And again, you're hiring the right person for the role. And when you are in a small business, that kind of arbitrary, this next hire needs to be of this gender. Well, actually, one, you should never do that, because you legally can't, but I know it happens. I think the challenge is then making sure that you're taking positive action rather than positive discrimination, because you could miss out on great candidates that have all of those things that may be of a different gender altogether. And, if you just wanted to focus on that sole issue or bring in a different type of diversity, and it's not always, one of the kind of codified government mandated, like protected characteristics that dictate diversity. And we kind of touched on this in a previous conversation, but I think it's different when you're a scale-up business to when you're an enterprise business, because when you are an enterprise business and you're working with hundreds of thousands of employees globally, well, actually, those codified ways of measuring and understanding the demographics of your employee base are much more important, because you are working with a much larger set of people, and you can start to draw those correlations and think about where you might have challenges with diversity of thought and background, etc. But when you are in that kind of small environment, well, actually, it's all of those, like, what are we actually trying to hire? What are we actually trying to achieve? And you don't necessarily want to be restricted because of something arbitrary that's come, or sorry, arbitrary is probably not the right phrase, but like something that's been almost seeped into the organization, as your phrasing was, because of external pressure, because of this echo chamber, because of this focus. And I also think that, kind of final thought on that part, I also think the other challenge is the echo chamber that has the focus on women in tech means that lots of other areas of diversity are often overlooked when it comes to technology hiring in particular, because there is such a big focus, because that's where the biggest gap is, but it doesn't mean there's not big gaps elsewhere. So when you think about the kind of setup within your org, like, where are you now in terms of that conversation? How has that changed? Are you still, feeling that the external pressure is coming in, or do you feel that you've got a kind of balanced position?
I think like this has been one of the most impressive things about my company actually since joining. Like, I did that workshop when I was relatively new to the business, and the support behind it was phenomenal. Like, the leaders, genuinely looked to their like direct reports to try and understand if they felt like there was restrictions in their progression based on their, any kind of reason. And it was amazing. And I think like we have this like incredible open conversation now around diversity within the business. Like, why, like the sort of why are we hiring for this role has become more and more important over time, and what we actually need for this role sort of goes along with that. And the kind of aim is, as long as we eliminate discrimination from the process, which I know is much easier said than done, then we will end up with diverse hires. And something that you were talking about a second ago, but what I'm trying to do at the moment is to really to know exactly what you're hiring for when you're hiring. I think it would be really interesting to understand how to scale that. Like, what you're saying is entirely true. Scaling something that is so much about someone's personality is tough, but to have really, really clear what you need from someone should theoretically mean that you hire more diversely, because that ability for bias is less. If you've said they need to be, they need to have React and Excel experience, but they also need to be, empathetic and collaborative or whatever. So if you're clearly measuring specific things, then the diversity is opened up. I think when you're kind of arbitrarily hiring, or you've got a job description which it hasn't necessarily been justified that well, that's when you end up being more discriminatory and bias kind of comes in more.
And so often as well, particularly in smaller businesses, we are a smaller business ourselves. One hire in a team can make a dramatic difference in terms of the way in which that team operates and therefore the way in which the business operates. And that's true, of course, at a larger scale. But when you're thinking about pods of salespeople or pods of technical people or, product teams, etc., when you've got hundreds and hundreds and thousands, that impact on the business is, diluted, whereas the impact on the business of a particular hire is so important. And I love the fact that you've got that kind of buy-in and like a different way of framing and thinking about diversity. And I think kind of one of the things which, I know we kind of covered in the past before in kind of side conversations in a way, but it's like the outside of the, I suppose, protected characteristics where a lot of the data, a lot of the reporting, a lot of the stuff that you see events is focused on. Actually, it doesn't always show diversity, right? There was a great image of one of the previous government cabinets in the UK, and it was the most diverse government cabinet. And it was from an ethnicity representation, from an LGBTQIA+, from a gender perspective, like it was undoubtedly on paper one of the most diverse groups of people. And that was great to see, and that was great progression. And I think it was all of those things. But at the same time, almost half of those individuals had been at the same school. Many of them had been in the same class, and had had the same mentorship and had worked at similar companies, etc. So how much diversity is there really within that team? So what do you think are some of the groups which maybe don't have that coverage because they're not within that protected characteristic? Like, what's a different frame of thinking about diversity from your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think like that's really good. That's a really good analogy to use, actually, because I think that's exactly what's happening in businesses at the moment. So I think that in terms of diversity of the business and businesses, I've been in agency recruitment, I've been in other companies as well. The diversity that I see the least, so this is something that you can actually like see or hear, is like accents. So way more like, no matter what color skin you have or what gender you are, or like, I think probably disability as well actually is something that is still like massively not represented. But yeah, accent, honestly, that's the biggest blocker I think for at the moment, because it's class really at the end of the day.
And I think that socioeconomic status, and I think you've captured it in a way in which, in parallel to the way in which we view ethnic and gender diversity as something that's visible, it's something that's audible, which is somebody's accent, the way in which they speak, and like you're saying, it is generally connected to class or the region in which someone comes from. And I think it's a really good thing to call out. And socioeconomic status is such a hard thing to quantify, right? It's such a hard thing to measure and think about how you bring into your organization, but it's the lowest common denominator of opportunity. And it's regardless of background, your status in society generally tied to wealth dictates the opportunities you have available to you.
And I think the difficult thing about that is that a lot of interview processes rely on a candidate having a certain level of education or experience pre-existing. So actually, like, a lot of our interview processes that we currently have within like probably the whole of, I don't know, maybe the whole of the tech industry is not set up for people who haven't been like taught how to do some level of public speaking or some level of interview experience or some level of education that sets them up for that. So yeah, it's kind of like, how are we going to tackle that one, And
scorecards, and like, there's some great interview tools which are out there now, and I really do think that they are for the betterment of the industry. But I'd love to see how they pick up on these types of things, because actually, when you go back to that skills versus strengths, somebody might not have those particular skills, but they may have those strengths as an individual. They'll have higher levels of resilience, higher ability to deal with change, etc. A lot of those soft skills which people are really looking for within organizations, because they haven't had such an easy upbringing, and maybe they've moved house more frequently. Or I think some of the other big forgotten groups that we don't speak about enough are people in care, are orphans, are refugees. There's numbers of groups of people that would fit into many other diversity, protected characteristics, or maybe fit into none of the protected characteristics that are underrepresented, but may have had circumstantial impacts that are far greater in terms of like their ability and their opportunity. And I think that point on interviewing is so crucial. If you are in private education, paid for education for any listeners in other regions that public is paid and private is not, it flips for some reason, depending on where you are in the world. But you are generally afforded the opportunity for multiple rounds of employability and, interview training versus maybe 30 minutes, which is the average provided by schools in the UK, for example, for like that careers coaching. So yeah, again, it's like another brilliant thing to call out there as teams are thinking about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I also think that something really interesting is the attitude towards kind of coaching candidates in the interview process. So this is something that we've been working with recently, especially with entry-level candidates, is that we use a one-sided video interview process as for a lot of our roles as the first stage. So we video ourselves saying, hello, can you answer this question for us? And then they video themselves back answering the question. And one thing I noticed is that actually a lot of the time answering that video the first time round is the first time they've done they're not used to interviewing. They're not used to doing a one-sided interview. They don't have no idea how to answer this question well. So I've been sort of working with giving them feedback and then getting them to do it again. And this has been honestly game-changing for a lot of the candidates because it shows if they can take on feedback and change, develop their technique. It's amazing how much it shows and how much they previously would have just been rejected for not having a good enough first video. So it's things like that. It's definitely how can we give people a bit more of the benefit of the doubt, because otherwise we will be just filtering, even if we're not being discriminatory, we will be just filtering people out by not trying to help them through the process a bit more.
And I think it is one of those really kind of combative areas of how much prep do you want to give? Do you want candidates that, candidates could end up over prepared and then, potentially overperforming in the interview, which is then not a reflection of them as an individual. It impacts your quality, retention, all of those things. But then at the same time, you've got people that aren't as honed, aren't as polished, haven't had that opportunity to gain those skills, which so much of it is the game of being employed. It's knowing how to format a CV, it's knowing how to turn up to interview. And yes, there's lots of resources online, but nothing beats that person-to-person connection that you get, that experience that you get from being around people that have done that. And if I think about some of my own reflections, two of the most successful people I've ever hired and had the pleasure of working with, both in an interview environment, I think if you had a scorecard system or if you had something that was automated, they wouldn't have performed well. On one of those occasions, we redid the interview, to run through it, to your point. And I love that kind of, coaching, go back, work on it and have that opportunity. Again, becomes more challenging as you move up the volumes and move up the scale because you can't necessarily afford to re-interview. And I think it actually poses one of those great questions again, as people move more and more to tools that support their interview process, that support their sourcing process. Well, are we going to be missing out on some of those individuals that don't have that opportunity to perform well in that environment, if you know what I mean, in that kind of practice setting?
Yeah, 100%. It'd be really interesting to know how potential overuse of tech in recruitment processes is going to impact on people that are already disadvantaged. For example, people with sort of certain socioeconomic status.
Yeah. And I love that. And I think the one thing I was about to say that I realized we could do a whole nother episode on it is then, candidates that are polished because they've got a program running alongside them and they're, able to complete an interview and seemingly have all of the knowledge connected to that position. And we're going to continue to see that rise. We're going to continue to see that challenge. And again, are we missing out on people that maybe don't have access to those tools, those tech, the things which aids them? And so I think, that human connection is just so important, and just asking those human questions of why are we doing this? Which I think was so important right at the front of this. What is our objective? What are we actually trying to achieve? And if we're not discriminatory as part of the process, then we're going to get to a diverse outcome. But of course, you need to monitor that to make sure that's the case.
This is what I thought was really interesting that you said, skip a few questions back, was this thing about how do we know that 50% of women should be in engineering in the first place, sort of thing. And I think that's I wish I had the answer to this because it's such an interesting point, is should 50% of men and women be in every single job in tech? Or is it okay for there to be more of a balance? And how do we know when that balance is, if you had 100% of men in your engineering and 100% of women in your HR, is that bad, or is that highlighting a problem? Understanding all of that would be so fascinating. I would love to dig deeper into it.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to when we work with a number of retailers, and it's generally speaking at store level, almost every single company is incredibly diverse and almost directly reflects the community that they work in, simply because the proximity of those stores means that you're only going to work for the one that's closest to you. You're not going to travel 20 miles to work for one when there's 5 within 5 miles. It's just as simple as that. I think it's then, that knowledge-based work where there is more of a clamour to have better balance across society, but then, are the systems which bring people into those roles, which aren't necessarily in the control of an employer, lending to that within your geography, within your region, within your industry. Like, I suppose it's the balance of what's possible based on what's available to you, and then what opportunities are you doing to create those outreach. So some huge topics that we've covered. I think a lovely framing of like just asking that question why at the front of the process, and then making sure you're honest with yourselves within your organization was a lovely setting. And yeah, thank you for raising some of those areas that maybe we haven't considered, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. It's been a pleasure.
Always. Thank you.